I'm Lauren. Here's my ID, and we'll go ahead and scan the room so that you can see my audience.
Film yourself.
Okay, so today I'm giving a speech on something that I seem to have a little bit of knowledge in as the assignment, and so I chose gardening because that's a new hobby of mine. So I am by no means a professional gardener. However, it is a new hobby of mine that I've come to take a lot of pride in. I've made plenty of mistakes in my garden this year, but I'm learning that it involves a lot of trial and effort when gardening. Most people have to try many different styles of gardening before they find what works for them. This can be due to different climates, different locations, temperatures, soil, and especially predators and diseases. So even though a lot of these factors are out of our control, we may have some influence over the effects of pests and diseases on our gardens. Healthy gardens are hard to come by due to a large abundance of these pests and diseases, and the key to having a healthy garden is knowing how to predict, prevent, identify, and treat those. So my intention in this speech is to discuss some of the issues that I've encountered with my garden and my approach at treating them and preventing their future occurrence. Prior knowledge of soil conditions and weather patterns can aid in preventing the onset of production problems. It's also important to know which pest and disease are detrimental to the crops you intend to plant. When prevention doesn't do the trick, there's still a possibility of treatment for some of the problems that may arise. Some of the more common problems that I've experienced with my garden are weeds, fungi, and nutrient deficiency. So I mentioned earlier that there's no such thing as a perfect garden, but I do think it's important to note that there's also no such thing as a weed-free garden. So I found myself pulling weeds in my garden day after day with still no end in sight. After much research, I finally found the answer as to where I was going wrong on finegardening.com. I'd given the weeds everything that they needed to thrive. After pulling all of the different weeds and removing the top layer of soil, all I did was expose the dormant weed seeds that were underneath. So what I needed to do instead was to mulch the top and prevent the light and water from reaching them. So this combination of light and water that I was giving them allowed for the weed growth to occur very quickly. I should have never given the weeds access to sunlight. So in this case, the best preventative measure, like I mentioned, is to mulch around your plants and throughout your garden beds to prevent and save a lot of time plucking out those pesky boogers. So weeds were always something that I knew to expect when tending to my garden. They had always been around and always will be around. In fact, I can still remember pulling weeds on the lawn with my parents when I was younger. But a problem that I was not anticipating stumbling upon is fungus. With the consistently damp conditions in our region, powdery mildew has been a never-ending battle on my nightshade plants. Powdery mildew can be easily identified though. So right here I have brought a visual aid, and this is a picture of powdery mildew on some nightshade leaves, and nightshades I mean squash or anything with taller leaves like that. So it will appear light gray or powdery on the infected leaves, and it also resemble mold. So that's a way to identify that if anybody wants to take another look. So in our region, it's nearly impossible to prevent this mildew, but I did take some advice from an article in Garden Design magazine that described different ways to get rid of it, and there's one preventative measure that worked for me. What I did is I went ahead and started trimming up some of the growth that was under my nightshade plants, and this allowed for more air circulation, and that kind of helped dry out the leaves a little bit faster and prevented all of that moisture. But treatment of the powdery mildew is a bit more complicated because that's your preventative measure. Treating it actually is going to involve what I would refer to as a sterile procedure. And because of this, you have to be very meticulous when dealing with mildew spores because of their ability to regenerate so easily. The best way that I've found to treat powdery mildew is to remove the problem itself. Removal of the dead or diseased foliage is key in doing this. After removing infected parts of the plant, you need to make sure to disinfect any pruners or shears that you used, and also to go ahead and throw out any of those trimmings that you had because the mildew spores do spread so easily. So this is important in preventing the cross-contamination and also reinfection of your host plant. So while battling against this mildew can be troublesome, the negative outcomes are not always detrimental to the plants. It just typically slows the growth of it. But what is detrimental that I have found is going to be a nutrient deficiency. So nutrient deficiency shows itself in many different ways. I've seen it inhibit growth of some of my plants, but worst of all, I've seen it cause blossom end rot also. Blossom end rot is one of the most heartbreaking problems that I've experienced in my garden, and it's typically due to a calcium deficiency. So just imagine the excitement felt when you see your little seedlings grow into a flowering plant that soon is going to turn into a vegetable. Once that vegetable starts, you see it turn into a brown mush on one end, and that starts spreading throughout the whole thing. It sure is heartbreaking. So when I first experienced this sinking feeling, I decided it was time that I do some research and figure out what was causing it. I found everything I needed to know on how to combat blossom rot from the Farmer's Almanac. According to the Farmer's Almanac, inconsistent watering is the main cause for calcium deficiency. So I mistakenly thought that by adding calcium I would be having a fix-all for my problem, but it was not the case. It turns out that in most cases there's already enough calcium in the soil, but they can't absorb enough of it because of their issues with the water uptake. So by watering evenly and consistently, you'll be promoting better uptake from the soil. So if you perform a soil test and find that there's not enough calcium present and you need some type of supplement, I suggest using something like this, which I call oyster shell. And you can get this, I get it at Tractor Supply in the chicken department, but it's literally just a crumbled up oyster shell. And I take it and I spread it over my flower beds underneath the plants. And then once the water comes in from the rain, or just watering that afternoon, I'm running out of breath, it'll help with that uptake. So hopefully this information has helped you see that there's in fact no such thing as a perfect garden. My methods may not always work for you too, but overcoming the problems in your garden will involve plenty of trial and error. So just remember that patience is a virtue in many aspects of life, but particularly so in gardening. Scan.